So now on to the main event. So I'd like to introduce our opening panel, day-to-day excellence, getting operations right. So as I'm sure you all know, senior living can be one of the most operationally intensive of any real estate asset classes. So we're here to find out, what does it take to provide the best resident experience in a financially viable way? And thanks again to our partner for this session, Gowling WLG. We've got an absolutely amazing panel to discuss this topic for you. Leading our discussion will be Dominic Morris, Head of Senior Living at Gowling WLG, and he'll be grilling Tom Lord, COO of Inspired Villages, Andrew Brown, Head of Healthcare at Target Healthcare, Julia Ashley, CEO of C&C Homes, and Nick Edwards, COO of Audley. And just very quickly before we get into the session, we're going to be asking your opinion to keep things interactive and gauge your opinion of this sector. So there is a poll that you can take during the course of the session. That's on the left-hand side of your screen. You can click on that. You can go in there at any point during the session and give your opinion, and we can come back to the results of that at the end. So that's quite enough from me. Over to you, Dominic. Do take us away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mike, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Mike says, in this session, we're going to be looking at the operation of retirement living communities. But just to frame that, I guess, for the purposes of our discussion, what we're talking about are independent living and assisted living schemes. These are schemes that often offer a range of on-site facilities and services, as well as having a safety net of resident support. I think it's fair to say that operators of these schemes are in it for the long haul. Their interests are closely aligned with those of the residents to ensure standards are maintained and property values with them. So providing a best of class operation should help to drive sustained value growth within schemes and provide a very attractive proposition, not only for the operators and their residents, but also for investors and funders increasingly looking at this space. So with the help of our panel, we'll be finding out what this looks like. To begin with, we're going to look at the resident experience. So retirement communities are about much more than the bricks and mortar. Why do people choose to live in these schemes, and what do they offer? So Julia, if I could turn to you in the first instance, please. How would you characterize the experience of being a resident in one of your communities, and has that changed much over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Changed greatly, actually, through the course of the pandemic. So our communities are in London, and some of them are big, 250 units of sheltered housing, which is sort of social, on the social housing scale. I suppose before the pandemic, they were big communities that spent an awful lot of time together, both informally and through organised activity. And I think people were very appreciative of that. It's one of the reasons why you might move to sheltered housing, that there's support on site and sort of friendship groups around you. I think through the pandemic, that's changed greatly with social distancing and people having to stay in their homes. We've been trying to get our residents engaged with technology for a long time now, and that's been quite a slow burn. I think through the pandemic, that's been rapid. And I'd say we've come on light years in terms of adoption of technology. We've been giving out iPads on sign up to paying rent by direct debit, for instance, for quite a long time now. We actually gave out over 100 tablets, iPads right at the beginning of the pandemic to enable people to contact us and their families and stay in touch. I think there's much more pull now, and people are wanting, very, very demanding of Wi-Fi in every part of the building and technology to be able to connect both in conversation and with virtual online activities, of which sort of replacing physical in-person activities.
Super. Tom, I think you've had a sort of a similar experience really of the growth of technology through your villages over the last few months. I don't know if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, well, we run villages that are really focused on holistic well-being, social, mental, physical well-being of our residents, and obviously with a lockdown came a need to pivot on the services that we delivered, especially things like exercise classes and how do you get people to do that. And whilst balcony exercise classes are a good thing, we also turned to technology. started running exercise classes on Zoom, through to wine tastings and gin tonic hour, to keep the communities connected with each other. We launched a thing we called the Virtual Village Centre on Facebook back in March as a way of just trying to have a platform that could connect our communities with all of these virtual things. We soon realised that why would that be just for our communities, and broadened it to their friends and family, to our colleagues, families, and ultimately just across the UK. We've collected 16,000 followers along the way of that Facebook page, 80% of them over the age of 75. And I think it just goes to show that this demographic isn't shy of technology. And 80% of them have access to iPads or smartphones, etc. So there really is that opportunity to harness technology for the good. And I think that there's a lot of interesting things coming along in the future that can be used. I think we need to focus on life tech that can keep people active, engaged, rather than just care tech for this sector in the future.
Great. And Nick, the Audley experience?
I suspect quite similar in a way to what Tom and what Julia's already said. Really, I mean, people move to our villages because of the lifestyle, because of the health and well-being aspect and the independence they get, which are all great positives: restaurants, bars, swimming pools, health and well-being facilities, and then wraparound care support. So when lockdown hit, that became very difficult. But as Tom said, moving into a way in which we could provide those services either in the gardens of our facilities or on the balcony or remotely through technology was a big plus. But we also did things like stop our restaurants serving food in restaurant, bring in other staff so that we could deliver it in a appropriately COVID protected manner to people's doors so that they had hot food, and then turned our sales staff into making calls into the local community to help support those people that we thought might need interaction and contact. And then what can you do when you've got a village and a platform like that? Well, you drive further contact into the local community. So making more calls to people, making sure that they feel supported. So I think that the concept of a village just being for the owners and the customers in the village was expanded out into the community far more than ever before, so that those villages feel very much a part of the community. And I think that we did a great deal of good, and I'm sure that Julia and Tom would say the same. You know, pushing out into the community to help those communities at their time of need was a big positive, both for our staff, I think, but also the on benefit that our owners felt about being associated with it.
And do you think you've sort of learnt more about what your residents' priorities and concerns are as a result of that experience, Nick?
I think the engagement with our owners has been incredible. I think that there isn't a single owner who we haven't had more touch points with through lockdown, far more significantly than we would have done in the past, I think. So yeah, we do know more about what they think and feel about things. I think driving change has been a huge positive. It was almost a free pass, if you like, through Corona. We could try things that we hadn't tried before, because if we failed, we were trying it out of a need. It was almost a desperation to get content to our owners and into the community. And if it went a bit pear-shaped, that's okay. You know, needs must. We were sort of on a wartime footing, if you like. So that kind of engagement was really positive. And it didn't matter if we got things wrong. And we've learned a lot from it. We did get a few things wrong. We got a ton of things right, all for the benefit of for our owners and for the community.
Great. Andrew, as an investor, Target Healthcare, focusing on the care home sector, what insights can you give us about how your operators, I guess, meet the needs of their residents, and both during this year and more generally, and with a sort of, I guess, a spotlight on learnings for the retirement living community sector?
Well, I suppose the sector I'm mainly in now, you know, care homes, it's more a needs-led sector, you know, so people come in at a frailer time in their lives, you know, perhaps more aged, needing care or help, you know, more so than the retirement side. I think, although we've heard, you know, sort of many horror stories, you know, sort of in the media about care homes during the COVID time, the residents, have had some benefits in the sense that it's not been all locked down, sort of within the homes. I mean, there has been periods when residents were, sort of tried to be kept in their rooms, sort of isolation periods, when there's times of concern. But on the whole, residents managed, to form a bubble within the wider home, and sort of life has gone on to a certain extent within that. So there's been some benefits of sort of living in a larger bubble. I was privileged to go around a couple of retirement facilities recently, and was interested to hear they'd formed a bubble in the wider sort of village as well, which was interesting and something I never thought could have happened, but had been very successfully done. What advice can I give to my colleagues on the retirement side? Very difficult to say. I wouldn't like to presume too much. I think, probably like Nick was saying, need to just encourage the sort of in marketing particularly, encourage the benefits of community. There's no question that residents, probably in retirement and in homes, have benefited from that community feel. Residents in the community, the general community, have been isolated completely. And I think that we have to extol the benefits of being in a village or a community or a care home, to take away from isolation and to enjoy the benefits of company and friendship and support of staff.
We build these great facilities for our owners and our customers to use, and at times like this, actually, we can then use that platform out into the wider community. It almost feels like the obvious thing to do. There's a cost associated with doing it, but there's also a public good and a social benefit. And if staff aren't able to do what they were supposed to be doing because the restaurant's closed or the swimming pool's closed or whatever, then they can go out and do other things. And if that's creating content for websites to be delivered remotely, or it's helping cook food, or it's making calls into people that we know might be struggling, or supporting our carers by going out and doing care visits, then great. But that's what the platform, and that's what the village gives the local community. It's not always necessary to do that, but it's something that we should always be thinking about trying to do whenever we've got spare time, if you like, and spare capacity in our village operations.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with Nick on that. I think the social impact value of retirement communities is right at the core of what we do. And I think most of us across the sector are led by a deep purpose-led approach to combat loneliness, to help people live healthier years of life. And that doesn't stop at the end of the road to a village. It's in all of our teams. So I mean, we've introduced a thing we call Inspired Friendships, which we put in place before we open a village in a local area, and that reaches out to lonely older people. And in the last few months, I think that's proved invaluable. Okay, we can't organise the events at the moment that we would previously do, but it maintains connection and makes sure that people feel like they're part of something bigger, and don't feel so isolated during isolation.
It's interesting you both sort of reference social impact and that community engagement. And I think the senior living sector generally, and this sector specifically, has so much to offer in terms of that ESG, social impact, sustainability agenda through the healthcare and support it provides for residents, that community engagement, the employment opportunities, the list goes on. But Phil, if I could draw you into the conversation, I'm not sure you were formally introduced at the beginning, but Phil Schmid from CBRE, welcome to the panel. What is your sort of view of the significance of ESG and the social impact, sustainability and gender for the sector? Should it be a core part of its DNA going forward?
I think it probably already is, if I'm honest. I think it forms part of the social care sector, so it has social in its I guess at its heart already. I think for a lot of investors now, looking at who are thematic, demographic driven, etc. It's, it is an obvious area that they want to look at. They want to invest. They want to deploy money. Their investors, pensioners, individuals, the same customer base that are living within the operator schemes, are driving that. People want more sustainable, impactful investment, and so I think we will see, and we are beginning to see, far greater investment in this market from these investors as they start to look at ancillary areas. They've invested in student housing, built to rent. The number of the big institutions that we'd all recognise from the UK pension funds are all beginning to dip their toe in the water. Royal London with their deal with Audley. We've got Legal and General already in with Inspired Villages. So they are following that trend, and I think that goes from both an investor end but also the end consumer. In the villages, certainly the feedback we get from a number of the operators is the end consumers are asking the questions. Who are your investors? What's their ethos? What's their background? And it goes right down to the nuts and bolts of how they run the village. Certainly, where does your energy come from? What's your green agenda for running this village? And I think it's embedded within the whole industry already. I don't think it's necessarily something that we need to look at doing going forwards. I think it's already part and parcel.
It's interesting because it's not something we spend a lot of time talking about. I haven't done in the past, but when you compare the CSR ESG benefits of retirement communities versus student housing or build to rent, for example, they're head and shoulders above. I mean, there's just no comparison in terms of the benefits to wider society from building a retirement village versus building a build to rent scheme or building a student accommodation block. There is a completely different dynamic in play. Sure, we might need more student beds in certain locations, and we absolutely need more affordable rental flats, but we completely and utterly need a whole lot more retirement village or age appropriate accommodation, and with the health and well-being benefits that go alongside that for people that are able to move into these villages. There's a whole different angle, and if we can build them in the right way and build in sustainable technologies in the right way, then so much the better. But yeah, I agree, Phil. It's already there. It's already happening.
And I think the sector is again in a great place because it's scaling up from a relatively small base, and it can, as you say, build all of this in as it develops and become sort of an exemplar of all these behaviours. Julia, what's your view in terms of sustainability and how that sort of washes through C&C's business?
We're in a slightly different position, I guess. We're a 94-year-old organisation, and with a legacy of stock that was built in the sort of 60s, 70s, and the sustainability agenda is massive for us. I think on the sort of social side and the governance side of ESG, we're kind of, this is our bread and butter. We're, this is just what we do. I think on the sustainability side, we've got our new build program, which you can plan this in. We've got a whole retrofit program, and that's quite a big challenge for us because obviously we're a provider of affordable homes, so our rental streams are limited. They're capped by government policy. So actually, to meet the agenda of sustainability, we need to just remodel our business plan basically and think of new ways of approaching that. And I think we're sort of grappling with the new technologies that are out there at the moment, and I think there's a certain path through that for us, which is around building resilience so that we can adapt the new technologies later on, but actually let the spike of the kind of technology happen in the next few years, which inevitably will move on greatly in the next few years, and then be ready to adapt to what actually sticks.
Thank you. And Tom, from the Inspired perspective, what does sort of sustainability look like on site in terms of on-site energy facilities, in terms of design of buildings?
So, I mean, there's no doubt that ESG is a priority and becoming one of kind of top priorities for most investors out there. I think it's really important that we look at that, and as you do, the social impact side of things, the well-being side of things, and supporting an aging population, we have in spades across the sector. I think when you look at the environmental side of things, we've probably got more than you would imagine, with lots of green spaces and trees, etc. But when you think of the biggest priorities around net zero homes and kind of zero waste to landfill over the next 10, 20, 30 years, we've got to start looking at that now. And I think we've got to grapple with the answer to how do you build net zero villages in the future? How do we understand embodied carbon, and how to tackle that whole piece? And if we don't start looking at it now, there's no way that we'll meet those targets. So we're looking at how to design in renewable technology, ground source heat pumps. Where does PV go? You have to design it in right from the start, right down to the choice of carpets ultimately, and strangely the cement that you use, which I didn't know until about a week ago. But I think there's a real opportunity for us, not only with that social impact piece, but in the environmental space. We're a small sector at the moment, and I think we could have a great story to tell if everybody if we didn't just have a slow march towards net zero and reducing carbon, but if we put our backs into it as a sector, we'll be able to tell a great story around the environmental impact of our villages and how sustainable they are. And I think the story that then ultimately, you've got to hope that when we start talking to planning officers and the like, and we tell the social impact story and the environmental story together, then the possibilities and the opportunities will increase. And I think it goes to residents as well. I think they are interested in buying sustainable properties. They're coming from a place where it would cost a lot to convert a 4 or 5 bedroom home to make it sustainable. But on that move into better accommodation, then, I mean, the surveys tell us that 85% of people would pay a bit more for a sustainable property. And why would that be any different for the over 65s? I just think there's a big opportunity with it.
And Dominic, I think there's an interesting dynamic with the ESG, because I think there's a lot of focus obviously on the obvious things. You focus on green, carbon neutral, things like that. But I think one of the areas, and maybe Andrew, you see some of this in the care space, is one of the sort of, I guess, the pushbacks we get sometimes from parties is around affordability, and affordable with sort of a little a rather than a capital A. Around, they sort of maybe they're looking at the care home sector, looking at the senior housing sector, and they see it as targeted for the sort of the upper quartile, and they can see lots focused at the lower quartile, and their sort of question, and sometimes a push to us, is, well, what about those that sit in that middle? And actually, from an ESG point of view, how do you provide for all and not just be seen to be providing for the lowest or the highest, and fill that bit in the middle? I think that's been quite an interesting push for us, both across senior housing but also within the care space. And I don't know if Andrew sees that when he's looking at the care space from his investor base as well.
Yeah, I think I've always been frustrated in a sense by sort of ESG, primarily probably because I didn't understand it fully when the term first came out. And so I've educated myself and thought, in some respects, it's about respect, isn't it? It's about respect for the environment, and respect for the people you're looking after, your customers, your staff. It's respect for the governance. And I don't like some of the tokenism around ESG. I don't like this idea of creating a list. My dad used to say, you know, there's no point in spray painting the car if the chassis is rusted, you know, and sort of putting, you know, sort of solar panels on, and that's kind of happened a little bit in the care home space, you know, where, you know, that we've sort of bolted on things that, you know, we hoped would improve, you know, sort of the environmental side of things. As others have said, you know, the social side, we've got it in spades. But I think, you know, Juliet sort of mentioned that one of the problems we do have, you know, sort of in the sector as a whole, probably more so in the care home space, is that, you know, many of the care homes, you know, across the country are just, in a sense, dated, you know, and not fit for modern purpose. And I think investors have to look very closely at, you know, don't just look very closely at the ESG, you know, sort of the nice shiny bits, but, you know, you need to look at, you know, what's behind, you know, the design of the building, you know, en suites. I mean, 75% of care homes do not have proper en suites in the sector, you know, so there's a huge amount of work to be done sort of on the environmental side in care homes, and not just on, you know, sort of the more obvious things like, you know, sort of heating systems and solar panels. But I think the retirement side, retirement living, you know, probably has, you know, it's probably building many more new facilities, you know, than the care side, which is, you know, which is good.
Thank you. So we talked about technology and we talked about sort of the fabric of these villages, but obviously fundamentally this is a people business and staffing sits at its core. So Nick, I wonder if you talk to us a little about sort of some of the opportunities and challenges around staffing at these schemes.
It's hard work. So being a general manager or operations manager in a retirement village is tough. It's not like running a hotel, because the people you interact with are there every single day. And if they've got issues, those issues stick with them. So that's the downside bit of it. It's quite hard. It's really hard work. It's not an easy job. The upside is that it can be tremendously rewarding, because you are interacting with people at a point in their lives where they can really benefit from some support. So there's upsides and downsides. Recruiting people for the long term is really difficult, as I said, because it's a hard job. That's just on the sort of the operational management side of it. So it's important to provide the support through training programs. It's important to recruit the right people in the first place, to have deep pools of people you can go to. They're both kind of critical in maintaining a healthy and happy village. I think on the care side, the biggest driver actually in care recently has just been the uptick in the value that society puts on carers, and that's largely as a result of Corona. And I think society just appreciating what carers do. Now, care is a relatively poorly paid profession. We pay above the minimum wages. We pay travel time and so on, and that helps us keep our care staff in place. But again, it's down to the culture of the organisation, helping support those members of staff. But again, these are not easy roles. Frontline roles in operational management or in care are challenging and demanding. So it's no surprise that there's churn. Our job is to try and provide as much support as we can to people in those roles. And if we can keep that high profile in care, where it rightly should be, right at the forefront of a positive image for society, that will definitely help. I'm not sure whether it will stay there for the long term. I desperately hope that it will do, because I think there's people that have provided incredible service through all types of areas of care over the last 9 months deserve our utmost praise for what they've done. And I hope desperately that continues. I hope they don't have to keep doing what they've been doing for the last 9 months, but I hope the positive sentiment towards them continues for a long time to come, because it's what they deserve.
Absolutely. And Julia, I guess from your perspective, as London focused, does that present more challenges, different opportunities in respect of staffing?
Yeah, well, yes. So we're central London, and you know, we've got big schemes. We've got just about every culture, language, religion you could imagine in our schemes. We have high levels of mental health difficulties. Our staff are incredible. They come to join us because they believe in what they're doing generally. And they've just been incredible through the pandemic, particularly. And I think, I'd agree with Nick, both in our housing schemes and in our care homes, I think the teams have formed a much stronger bond than they ever had before. Our turnover is plummeted. People want to be part of the team that is the one that's making the difference. They're finding novel ways to work together through multiple challenges. We've got an incredible amount of support from the local communities, or, for instance, a day in the life of a housing officer in central London in one of our sheltered schemes would be to be getting a delivery from a food bank, or going to get the food from a food bank, or surplus stores from a supermarket, bagging it up, knocking on 200 doors to deliver food parcels, and doing the same tomorrow and the day after. And this is just a small example of the sort of ingenuity and the passion and they've just been fantastic. I can't speak highly enough of them. And I agree with Nick, they really deserve a much greater profile than they've had previously. And I think there is national awareness now that people working in this sector, particularly in the care homes, have been heroes throughout the whole pandemic. And I second that.
Yep, I would third that. Tom, from the Inspired Villages perspective.
Yeah, and a little bit from a personal perspective. As a hotelier of over 20 years, I'm not sure I entirely agree with Nick's position that it's that different. Yes, people that come to hotels stay for 1.5 nights, and our residents stay for 8 years, but that allows us more opportunity to understand who they are, what they want, what their needs are, and personalize the service that we deliver to them. So we've had some real success recruiting some fantastic talent in our village managers from the hotel sector, which at the moment is decimated through COVID. And our team, these people have come to us, and at the core of somebody that works in hospitality is really about delivering great service to people and running great teams. And that is at the core of what we want to do at Inspired Villages. It's enabling people to live the best years of their life and really focusing on that proactive element of well-being and keeping people well for longer. And hoteliers are used to the hard work and rolling the sleeves up and providing that level of service. So I think there's a real crossover. We're on the peripheries of hospitality rather than the core kind of bit that hotels do. I completely agree that this year has brought our teams together. We see that through our engagement surveys. It's tied everybody to the purpose of the company, and that life with Inspired should be some of the best years of your life. And we're all focused on delivering that for the residents. We've increased communication. I think this year's been great for a focus on that and thinking differently about how we communicate with our teams, and a weekly call from our CEO live with questions from the team got put in place. Now, we probably wouldn't have done that had it not been for COVID and embracing digital. But there are some silver linings and lessons that we've learned through this year that will carry on into the future to ensure we keep our teams engaged and our fantastic culture in place.
Thank you. And Phil, I think it's clear from this discussion, if it wasn't for, there are some parallels between sort of retirement living communities and operating them, and BTR and hotels and other, if you like, specialist residential sectors. What do you think are any of the sort of learnings that this sector can take from those?
I think it's probably emphasising you've got a demographic and a needs-based client group. Hotels are to a degree either business-led. We don't know what's going to happen. How quickly the world is going to get back to normal. you've got a client group that is there and planning to live in these things, wants to stay there, is looking for that lifestyle, the connection, all the factors we've touched on. There's some, obviously some parallels there with things like BTR on that side of things. I think one of the interesting bits I think is going to be how the effect of the current situation alters both attitudes and approaches to things like tenure. If there's slowdowns in housing markets, things like that, if you've got a needs-driven product or a need that isn't going away, is getting worse, actually, being able to move and not necessarily immediately have to sell your house, is an interesting route. And certainly we've seen some of the operators benefiting from that, able to offer flexibility to their consumers and their customers to be able to move in quicker. So I think that's going to be an interesting change. That certainly was a driver towards more rental over in the US, slowdown in the housing market, a bit of stagnation there, and actually staying and thinking about capital growth wasn't necessarily on the table. So it became about, is this the right place? So I think that's going to be an interesting area to look at. And I think, the impact on some of those other sectors, particularly for investors, in terms of, well, where else can you deploy your money? Where else can you invest on behalf, the amount of money coming into some of these investors isn't reducing, and they can't just keep necessarily stockpiling money. So that is prompting certainly more parties to look elsewhere and actually look at those ancillary markets that sit alongside things that they know and understand. And you've only got to look at Carlisle, obviously acquiring Beechcroft, which CBRE advised on. You've got Lone Star obviously looking at McCarthy and Stone. Suddenly, having had a flurry back in 2017, a lot of those investors have spent the last sort of 2 years going, well, hang on a minute, AXA, Legal and General have invested. What is it? What does it look like? It's taken people 2 years to kind of go on that journey, look at things, think about what they want, and then realize what they can get. And we're just starting to see some of those transactions starting to come through. And I think the range of investors talking to us now, the range of parties investing and looking at it, because they're going, I can see the hotel element, I can see the BTR, I can get comfortable with the risks and how this works. There's a few things that they're still having to get their head around and understand, but there's certainly lots of parallels they're able to draw on and recognize on what they do elsewhere, which means that it's not quite as scary, and presenting to an investor base and your IC, it becomes an easier step to make that move into what is a newer sector for them.
Super, thank you. Mike materializes on screen, which I think is my cue to hand over the reins.
Sure, yeah, I've appeared from the ether. So thank you so much to the panel for that discussion. A couple of questions from the audience to pick up on. A question from Anthony Oldfield. I'll send this to you, Julia, first, and then gauge the opinion of the rest of the panel as well. If you had to pick, one or maybe two key bits of advice on running a facility to a new operator, what would be, if you had to boil it down to those absolute essentials, what would you sort of say?
There's so many. I suppose the first one is make sure you've got the right people delivering the service, because actually they need to want to do this, and they need to be bought into the social kind of value and the social angle of that, and want to really help people, and give them good training programs, and just align them with your objectives. I suppose the next one is to engage and involve your residents, because if you don't, you're going to come unstuck. I think they're the ones living in the buildings, they're the ones that know what's needed, and they're the ones that are going to help you be successful.
Sure. The rest of the panel, any advances on that?
I'd say make sure that your sales staff are really well trained, because the biggest issue new operators will have is that their sales guys will oversell the operating capabilities of the business, especially if it's a startup. and you create more headaches by overselling something to a customer base that you'll never be able to reverse out of. So it makes sure your sales team know exactly what it is that you operationally are seeking to deliver, and then make sure that well, obviously you then deliver that clearly, but they don't oversell.
Yeah, and the thing I'd add, Mike, is be clear on what your proposition is. Don't try and be absolutely everything to absolutely everyone, because you'll fail. Understand the most important moments for your residents. What is it you've got to do brilliantly above everything else? What those big rocks, and yeah, have a team that are passionate about doing what they do and delivering great service and caring for the residents of the village.
Sure. Andrew, from your care home perspective, go on.
Yeah, I think it's, a big part of it is communication, isn't it? It's, especially when the village is up and running, the communication is absolutely essential. Residents, and staff become, frustrated by lack of communication, by lack of direction, by not hearing what's going on or what's proposed, or communication is a biggie, I suppose, in any business, but particularly so in a village where people want to feel part of it and want to get things done.
Sure. And Phil, from your helicopter view as an advisor, what would you say?
I think for me, it's having a good manager. Whether it's a care home, whether it's a retirement scheme, we joke that 9 times out of 10, that first impression, that first interaction with that manager, you can tell whether that scheme is going to be well run, efficient, effective, well thought of by the residents. I think that for me is probably number one, is that management of the scheme.
Sure, thanks. And just to touch on the results of the poll that we've been asking you. So the question we asked was, which of the following on-site factors will be most important for the successful operation of retirement communities in 5 years' time? And to run through the results, top of the list with 39% of the votes, so a good share, a compelling lifestyle and well-being offer for residents. Next up with just sort of 20% well-designed homes. ESG and sustainability, which we touched on there with 12%. Flexible tenure options for residents with 17%, and a fully integrated platform where the operator directly delivers all the asset management, hospitality and care services with about sort of 14%. So that compelling lifestyle sort of very, very clearly the top result there. What do you make of that, Dominic, and how well is the sector doing in terms of delivering that sort of compelling lifestyle and well-being offer, do you think?
I think it's doing very well. I think it's a question of getting the message out to the market, the target audiences. People that come and visit these schemes are sort of invariably wowed by what's on offer. And I think, as the panel have been saying, it's that experience and that offer has almost intensified. And as the sort of the well-being and health and lifestyle agenda gets more and more focused as we go forward, I think that's going to become more and more important.
Sure. That point on flexibility of tenure option for residents, are we seeing more of that? Anyone on the panel got any views on that? We're seeing more kind of flexibility of tenure and a sort of more differentiated offer from operators?
Definitely. I think it's coming, it will come. We will certainly be doing it. So yeah, without a doubt. It's about getting the right product. So the hardware, what it looks like, the design, marrying that with the right service offering, what do people really need? And then trying to find the right way of pricing it for people, essentially. What is it that they can afford to pay to come and have that lifestyle? And that's on us to create the product, and then we've got to figure out what the right pricing structure is, whether it's long-term or short-term tenure.
Sure. Well, thank you so much to our panel for that incredibly in-depth and erudite look at all of the elements of, as I said earlier, that most sort of complex of real estate asset classes. Everyone in the audience will have taken away something from that, I'm sure. So thank you so much to all of you. For our audience, As I mentioned earlier, we've got speed networking available in the lobby area. You can go in there and sort of sign up for that, and also our expo room with booths from all of our various partners for the event, where you can explore and network in there as well. So that's ongoing now until 11:30, which is when we'll have our next session looking at the funding game, how to finance housing for our aging population needs. So now is your point to go and have a wee or go and get a piece of toast and a nourishing snack. But do join us again at 11:30 for the next session, and do also please use those networking and sort of booth functions as well. I'm sure you'll get plenty out of that. But thank you most of all to our panel for that excellent discussion. Thank you all so much.